It took less than 10 days to end more than a decade of war and topple a dictatorship that had ruled Syria for half a century. But all that history leaves a mark, and as rebels swept through Syria's cities one by one, the true extent of former President Bashar al-Assad's crimes began to be revealed. Torture, sexual violence, executions, hallmarks of his family's rule. In this video, we analyse satellite imagery and piece together testimony from survivors to map Assad's vast and heavily coordinated network of brutality. As Damascus fell to the rebels, footage began to spread of the city's notorious Juneja prison, known to locals as the human slaughterhouse. A horrific picture of life and death began to emerge.
انعدمت عالم كتير وكميات كتيرة يعني كانت يطلع بالمية 200 300.
Juneja was no doubt the pinnacle of the Assad dynasty's brutal network, but scenes similar to this have been repeated in prisons all across the country. According to the independent monitoring group, the Syrian Network for Human Rights, more than 1 million people have been arbitrarily arrested and released since the outbreak of war in 2011. In that time, at least 135,000 remained in prison, without trial, or disappeared altogether. This was all organised by a system first started by President Assad's father, Hafez, decades before. Torture and forced disappearances were a family business, and it was all ruthlessly managed by 4 intelligence networks. These agencies controlled detention centres across the country, notorious for their brutality. We've been able to locate over 90 suspected sites. Each agency was headquartered in central Damascus, in or near the Kafar Sousa district, an area known as the security zone. In the days after Assad fled the country, we were sent videos filmed at a military intelligence building known as Branch 291. They reveal an underground labyrinth of dark hallways lined with solitary cells not even big enough to lay down. Now empty but for the few items and messages left behind by detainees freed just days ago. Some dared to return to the buildings where they were once held, like this man, who was arrested on his way to university after attending an anti-regime protest. Syrians knew that, if summoned to Kafar Sousa for questioning, they might never leave.
كان آخر يوم شوف عبد الله فيه.
200 meters away, there's another facility known as Branch 215, or the Branch of Death. Officers here were dedicated to tracking down people the other agencies had failed to capture, essentially the regime's most wanted. Like in Branch 291, the holding cells were underground. Reports of 60 to 70 people packed into a space only 4 meters square. Survivors say people were left untreated after interrogations, with bodies rotting. Some of those who did not survive were buried in sites like this, 40 kilometers outside Damascus. Both locals and former government soldiers say this was a mass grave. We analysed satellite images of the site over a decade. In 2010, a year before major protests erupted against the government, the area was simply a field, with what looks like a tower and some scattered buildings. By 2011, at the start of the uprisings, one of those buildings had been demolished as the area was cleared. Then, in the following years, numerous trenches and pits start appearing across the site, repeatedly being filled in. Witnesses say it was in these trenches that hundreds of bodies were dumped. Vehicles can be seen as several holes continue to be dug, then filled, as well as what appears to be an excavator. By 2022, the site was covered over, removing all traces of the trenches. From branches 215 and 291 to the mass grave, this pattern was repeated across the country, orchestrated by Assad's ruthless network of brutality. It's estimated at least 15,000 people died as a result of torture committed by the Syrian government since 2011. As prisoners rotted in the dark of their cells, their families were systematically left in the dark too, with no information of the whereabouts of their loved ones or the reason for their disappearance. People not tortured for information or for committing any crime, but to degrade and humiliate them, all in the name of spreading fear and stifling dissent. As some now reunite, thousands are still left searching, and we may never know exactly how many lie hidden in mass graves or how many of the disappeared are now dead.